Leaving felt automatic to everyone else. The highways filled before anyone finished asking questions, cars stacked with decisions made quickly and defended loudly. I watched it happen from the edge of town. Not frozen, not conflicted. Just unconvinced. Movement looked like fear wearing logic, and I wasn't ready to borrow it. I stayed because the town made sense to me in a way crowds never had. It was small enough to read, limited enough to understand. I knew which lights belonged to businesses that would close early, and which windows stayed dark because no one lived behind them anymore. Familiarity didn't feel comforting. It felt measurable. The news kept insisting departure was survival, but it spoke in averages. Cities mattered in those calculations. Transit routes, population density, resource flow. My town barely registered on any of those maps. It existed between relevance and neglect, which suddenly felt like cover rather than weakness. I didn't announce my decision. Staying wasn't a stand. It was a refusal to react without data. I watched neighbors load vehicles with urgency that bordered on performance. Some waved. Some avoided eye contact. Everyone seemed relieved to be moving, as if motion itself promised safety. I walked the streets after most of them left, listening to how the town responded. Doors closed softly. Dogs barked once, then stopped. The absence of engines changed how sound behaved. I realized quickly that silence here didn't feel empty. It felt contained. This place had never been built to absorb attention. It serviced travelers, processed them, then released them back into motion. When the flow stopped, the town didn't collapse. It exhaled. Parking lots emptied. Signs stayed lit without purpose. Space returned to itself. Staying meant accepting visibility. In a small town, presence accumulates. Every action becomes a reference point. I understood that risk, but it felt preferable to becoming anonymous noise on a road designed for escape. Out there, I would be another signal. Here I could measure consequence. The outbreak was still abstract then. Numbers, alerts, language softened by distance. I wasn't denying it, I was localizing it. Threats behave differently when filtered through scale. In a town this size, patterns show themselves faster. I prepared quietly. Not hoarding, not fortifying. Just adjusting. I reduced movement. I simplified needs. I learned which routes echoed and which absorbed sound. The town offered feedback immediately, correcting mistakes without drama. What surprised me most was how calm staying felt. Not hopeful, not brave, just aligned. Leaving would have meant abandoning context for momentum. Staying let me observe before committing to anything irreversible. I didn't believe the town would protect me. I believed it would reveal itself honestly. That mattered more than promises made from far away. As the last taillights disappeared beyond the highway bend, the town settled into a stillness that felt earned, not imposed. That was the moment I understood my choice. I wasn't staying behind because I trusted the place. I stayed because I trusted my ability to read it while it was still legible. I noticed details I had ignored for years. The way weather lingered differently near the grain silos, how the water tower cast shade that shifted predictably across backyards. They were constants. Small towns teach patience by necessity. Nothing leaves unnoticed. That slowness creates accountability. When change comes, it can't hide behind scale. I valued that transparency more than speed. Staying also meant owning outcomes. There would be no one else to blame for misjudgment, no crowd to disappear into. That weight felt appropriate. As night approached, the town dimmed itself naturally. Porch lights clicked on, then off. A few generators hummed briefly, then stopped. The rhythm felt deliberate. I sat where I could see most of the main street without being seen easily. The emptiness wasn't threatening yet. It was instructional. I wasn't waiting for danger. I was studying baseline. When the first official evacuation siren finally echoed faintly from the highway miles away, it sounded misplaced. The town didn't respond. Neither did I. The decision had already been made earlier, quietly, without alarms. Staying wasn't resistance. It was timing. The town had never asked anyone to commit to it. That was its defining feature even before anything went wrong. It existed as a pause between destinations, a place designed to process people briefly, then send them onward. Trucks slowed here. Travelers refueled. Conversations lasted just long enough to remain polite. Permanence was optional. Main Street told that story clearly. Businesses opened early and closed early, aligned with traffic patterns rather than community rhythm. Diners served people who didn't remember the names of the servers. Motels refreshed rooms daily for guests who rarely stayed 2 nights in a row. Even the signage faced outward, angled toward highways rather than homes. The town's economy depended on motion. When motion stopped, it didn't scream. It simply lost purpose. Registers still worked, shelves remained stocked for a while, but demand thinned immediately. Without turnover, supply became decoration. Residential areas reflected the same logic. Houses were modest, functional, rarely personalized. Yards stayed trimmed without flourish. Fences marked boundaries more than identity. People lived here because it was affordable, convenient, or temporary. Few treated it as destination. That transient design had benefits once. No crowds, no bottlenecks, no dense housing. Space spread outward generously, allowing distance without isolation. When the outbreak began, that spacing felt like insulation. What the town lacked was redundancy. Small systems depended on consistent participation. One grocery store, one clinic, one volunteer fire department stretched thin even during normal times. These weren't weaknesses under routine conditions. They became pressure points when routine failed. Social ties were shallow but civil. People recognized faces without knowing histories. That anonymity reduced friction. It also meant trust hadn't been tested much. When uncertainty arrived, familiarity wasn't deep enough to anchor cooperation. I walked the perimeter daily, learning how the town fit together spatially. The edges faded quickly into farmland and scrub. No suburbs, no sprawl, just clean transition from pavement to dirt. That simplicity made movement predictable. The town centre functioned like a valve, open during the day, closed at night. After hours, activity collapsed entirely. That pattern repeated so consistently that deviation would be noticeable immediately. I realized then how exposed deviation would make anyone who stayed. Infrastructure here assumed outside support. Fuel deliveries, supply trucks, maintenance crews. When those stopped coming, nothing replaced them. The town didn't produce much on its own. It distributed. I noticed how quickly shared spaces lost relevance. The community centre locked early. The library stopped updating hours. Churches cancelled services without announcements. Not from fear, but from lack of attendance. Nobody arrived to keep the lights on. The town didn't resist this shift. It accommodated it. That adaptability looked calm on the surface, but it carried risk. Without friction, decline accelerates unnoticed. Emergency planning here relied on regional response. Evacuation routes led outward. Shelters were listed elsewhere. The assumption had always been that help came from beyond town limits. Staying meant accepting that assumption would fail quietly. I thought about why that didn't bother me as much as it should have. Maybe because dependency had always felt fragile here. The town survived by staying out of the way. That strategy didn't disappear during the outbreak. It intensified. The layout discouraged congregation. Few sidewalks. Large lots. Distance between buildings. Even during normal times, chance encounters were rare. That dispersal limited exposure, but it also limited mutual awareness. When people left, the town didn't hollow out dramatically. It thinned evenly. Each departure removed a small piece of function until function itself became theoretical. Nothing broke. It just stopped being necessary. I understood then that staying here wouldn't resemble defending a community. It would resemble monitoring a system designed to empty gracefully. The town wasn't built to hold people together. It was built to let them pass without resistance. That realization sharpened my caution. A place meant for passing through offers little forgiveness once movement ceases. It provides space, but not support. Structure, but not resilience. Still, I preferred that honesty. Cities pretended permanence. This town never had. It made no promises about survival, comfort, or continuity. It simply existed until there was no longer a reason for it to do so. If I stayed, it wouldn't be because the town could save me. It would be because its limitations were visible. I could track failure here. I could see when systems crossed thresholds. In a world where collapse hid behind scale, transparency felt like an advantage. This town wasn't a refuge. It was a case study. And I stayed because watching it fail slowly might teach me how to avoid failing with it. The first night it happened, I almost missed it. Habit filled the gap where awareness should have been. I was used to hearing engines after dark, the steady rhythm of tires passing through town on their way somewhere else. That sound had always been constant enough to ignore, like breathing you only notice when it stops. I realized it was gone while standing on my porch, doing nothing important. No headlights swept across the siding. No low hum drifted in from the highway. Even the occasional late truck failed to announce itself. The town wasn't asleep. It was paused. At first, I told myself it was timing. Maybe an accident farther up the road. Maybe weather rerouted traffic temporarily. Highways absorb disruptions all the time. That explanation fit neatly, so I let it sit for a few minutes, waiting for the noise to return and prove me wrong. It didn't. I walked closer to the road, not in a hurry, just curious. The asphalt reflected moonlight cleanly, uninterrupted by movement. The electronic sign near the junction still glowed, scrolling reminders meant for drivers who weren't there to read them. It felt like watching a performance continue after the audience had left. The absence carried weight. Traffic wasn't just sound here, it was validation. Proof that the outside world still flowed past us, acknowledging our existence briefly before forgetting it again. Without it, the town felt sealed, not physically, but conceptually. I waited longer than necessary, counting minutes the way I never had before. 10 passed, then 20. Still nothing. Even animals behaved differently. No startled movement from the brush. No sudden crossings. The road had become inert. I thought about how rarely I had seen the highway completely empty. Even during storms, something always pushed through. Someone always gambled on urgency over caution. That risk-taking had been reliable. Its absence felt intentional. I checked my phone, expecting alerts. There were none that explained what I was seeing. Updates spoke in generalities, numbers rising somewhere far away. No mention of closures. No confirmation of stoppage. The silence wasn't coordinated, at least not publicly. Back home, I turned on a radio out of habit. Stations played as scheduled, hosts speaking into a void, unaware or pretending to be. Ads ran for businesses that depended on travelers who weren't coming back tonight. Everything functioned except the thing that mattered. I stepped outside again before midnight, unwilling to accept coincidence. Still no movement. The road had lost its purpose entirely, reduced to a strip of pavement with no narrative attached. I realized then that the outbreak had crossed a threshold. It wasn't approaching, it had redirected flow. Traffic doesn't stop unless something forces it to. Not gradually, not politely. People reroute, they delay, they complain. But they move. When movement ceases altogether, it means decision has replaced convenience. I understood what that implied without needing details. Somewhere enough people had decided not to travel that the chain broke. That kind of decision doesn't happen in isolation. It spreads quietly through shared risk calculation. The town didn't react immediately. Porch lights stayed on. Televisions flickered behind curtains. A few people stood outside longer than usual, listening without admitting they were listening. Nobody spoke. Acknowledging it would have made it real. By morning, the stillness held. No delivery trucks arrived. No commuters passed through early. The diner opened out of routine, then closed before noon without explanation. Staff waited, then left. Not alarmed, just unnecessary. That night marked the end of the town as a waypoint. Once flow stopped, relevance followed quickly. Without traffic, we weren't connected to anything larger. We became a fixed point instead of a passing thought. I didn't celebrate staying then. I felt the cost of it. Staying meant accepting that whatever followed would arrive without warning or reinforcement. No one was coming through to carry news, supplies, or distraction. The first night no one drove through wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no roadblocks, just absence doing its work efficiently. Movement had been the town's lifeline. When it vanished, everything else became local. I slept lightly after that, aware that isolation had begun without permission. The outbreak hadn't reached us physically yet, but it had already changed our position in the world. We were no longer on the way to somewhere else. We were alone, and the road made sure we understood that before anything else did. The alerts started arriving late, and even then they felt borrowed. Messages written for places that mattered more than we did. Rewritten just enough to include towns like ours without understanding them. I read each one carefully, not for instruction, but for what it assumed about the people receiving it. They talked about congestion we didn't have, about transit hubs we'd never built, about shelter capacities that existed hours away, listed as if distance were irrelevant. The guidance wasn't wrong, it was misaligned. It described a world that required coordination at scale, and scale had never been this town's strength. Sirens never sounded here. The infrastructure existed, but it was designed for storms, not contagion. No one flipped the switch because no one knew when it would be appropriate. Without crowds, there was no pressure to perform urgency. Silence remained the default. I listened to emergency broadcasts on multiple frequencies, rotating between them as if triangulation might reveal something hidden. The language stayed cautious, abstracted to avoid liability. If advised. When possible. As conditions allow. None of it acknowledged places where advice couldn't be followed without inventing resources that didn't exist. The town council posted updates online, but they read like disclaimers. Links to state resources, phone numbers that routed elsewhere, responsibility exported upward, away from the place actually absorbing consequences. It wasn't neglect. It was design. Small towns operate on proximity, not protocol. Problems usually resolve through familiarity, not systems. When the outbreak demanded systems, familiarity offered no replacement. Everyone waited for instructions that weren't coming, then quietly adapted without announcing it. I watched people interpret messages selectively. Some latched onto reassurance, others fixated on worst-case phrasing. Nobody followed everything. The guidance conflicted with lived reality too often to be trusted wholesale. That inconsistency eroded authority faster than fear ever could. The clinic closed its waiting room first. Not officially. Just reduced hours, then stopped answering phones consistently. A sign appeared advising non-emergency cases to seek care elsewhere. Elsewhere meant driving. Driving meant exposure. Most people stayed home instead. Law enforcement adjusted presence subtly. Fewer patrols. Longer response times. Not from collapse, but from prioritization. There were fewer calls worth answering. With less movement, there was less to enforce. Order maintained itself through inactivity. Schools announced closures using language copied directly from larger districts. Remote learning options reference platforms many households here couldn't access reliably. Parents read the notices, nodded, then did what they always did. They adapted locally, ignoring the parts that didn't fit. The messages kept coming, growing more frequent but less useful. Each update layered on new caveats without resolving previous ones. They created a sense of motion without direction, urgency without clarity. Eventually, people stopped checking altogether. I realized the danger wasn't misinformation. It was irrelevance. Emergency systems hadn't failed us. They had bypassed us. The outbreak response flowed along lines of density and efficiency, skipping over low-impact zones quietly. That understanding changed how I listened. I stopped expecting answers and started extracting assumptions instead. Every message revealed what planners thought towns like ours were supposed to do. None of it matched what we could do. Without applicable guidance, the town defaulted to observation. People watched each other for cues. Stores adjusted hours based on foot traffic rather than policy. Behavior synchronized organically, not through instruction. I noticed how quickly official language lost power once it stopped influencing action. Authority depends on applicability. When advice can't be followed, it becomes noise. That noise faded faster than fear. By the time warnings sharpened, they no longer mattered here. We had already entered a different phase, one defined by local thresholds rather than national metrics. The outbreak wasn't something approaching. It was something unfolding quietly within our limitations. Emergency messages continued to arrive, but they no longer addressed us. They spoke over us, toward places still visible on priority maps. Our town existed between lines of concern, acknowledged only in footnotes. That absence forced clarity. Without direction, responsibility returned to individuals. Each decision carried weight because no higher authority could absorb it. That was unsettling, but it was honest. I stopped refreshing feeds after that. Not out of denial, but because information that couldn't be applied wasted attention. The town didn't need updates. It needed awareness. Emergency messages hadn't failed to reach us. They had failed to see us. And in that gap between broadcast and reality, the town began operating on its own terms, quietly severed from systems that no longer recognized it as worth addressing. In a small town, familiarity usually feels like insulation. Names come easily, faces anchor memory. You recognize trucks by dent patterns instead of license plates. Before the outbreak, that closeness passed for trust, even when it hadn't been tested. When uncertainty arrived, familiarity changed character. At first, people checked on each other casually. Conversations happened at distance, voices lowered instinctively. Questions stayed polite. Nobody admitted fear directly. They asked about supplies, about relatives elsewhere, about rumors they pretended not to believe. Information moved faster than comfort. I noticed how quickly assumptions formed. If someone didn't appear one morning, absence carried meaning. Missed routines became signals. The mail not collected. The porch light left on too long. Familiarity amplified every deviation, turning neutral behavior into narrative. Trust narrowed instead of expanding. Knowing someone well meant knowing their habits, their weaknesses, their likely responses under pressure. That knowledge felt dangerous once survival became personal. People stopped sharing specifics, answers shortened, doors closed sooner. I watched neighbors cross the street to avoid proximity they used to welcome. Not because of infection certainty, but because uncertainty demanded boundaries. The closer you were to someone, the harder it became to interpret their choices generously. The town had relied on informal accountability. Everyone knew who belonged where. That structure worked when expectations were stable. Once conditions shifted, those expectations turned rigid. Deviation invited scrutiny rather than curiosity. I overheard conversations that stopped when someone unexpected approached. Familiarity made privacy harder to protect. People adjusted by withdrawing completely instead of negotiating transparency. Silence replaced explanation. Social roles dissolved unevenly. Helpers burned out first. The people who checked on others stopped after realizing their concern wasn't reciprocated. Reciprocity requires capacity, and capacity disappeared quickly. Care became selective. The first argument I witnessed wasn't loud. It was controlled, almost rehearsed. Two people disagreed about resource use, both certain their interpretation was reasonable. Familiarity sharpened the conflict because neither could pretend ignorance of the other's intent. I realized then that knowing someone didn't guarantee alignment. It guaranteed expectation. When expectations broke, disappointment followed immediately. Strangers offered fewer assumptions, which suddenly felt safer. People started redefining distance. Physical space expanded. Emotional space collapsed. Relationships that relied on routine contact dissolved quietly. The town didn't fracture dramatically. It segmented. I felt it myself. I chose routes that minimized encounters. I timed movement to avoid predictability. Familiar faces triggered calculation instead of comfort. Each interaction required assessment I hadn't needed before. What surprised me was how little resentment surfaced openly. Everyone seemed to understand the shift intuitively. Nobody accused anyone else of betrayal. They simply stopped relying on each other. Cooperation requires trust, and trust requires surplus. Surplus had vanished. I noticed how quickly people rewrote memory. Long-standing goodwill didn't translate into present confidence. History lost authority. Only current behavior mattered, and behavior changed daily under pressure. The town still recognized itself visually. Houses remained occupied. Cars stayed parked in familiar places. But recognition no longer implied access. Knowing someone's name didn't grant entry into their decision-making. I thought about how cities anonymize by scale. Small towns anonymize by retreat. Both result in isolation, but through opposite mechanisms. Here, knowing too much made people cautious. Ignorance would have been easier. I stopped expecting collective response. Every household began operating independently, loosely aware of others but unwilling to synchronize. That fragmentation reduced risk of total failure, but it eliminated mutual support. The outbreak didn't turn neighbors into enemies. It turned them into variables, predictable, observable, but no longer dependable. Familiarity became data rather than comfort. I missed the old version of knowing people, but I understood why it couldn't survive intact. Intimacy demands trust, and trust demands safety margins that no longer existed. By the time the town adjusted fully, everyone knew everyone again, but differently. We knew patterns, not intentions, habits, not loyalties, presence, not availability. That shift marked a quiet end to community, as I had understood it. The town still contained people, but it no longer contained shared life. Everyone knew everyone until they didn't, and once that happened, the idea of us stopped functioning. What replaced it wasn't hostility. It was parallel survival. We occupied the same geography without sharing risk, responsibility, or reassurance. In a place defined by familiarity, that change was profound. I accepted it without protest. Expecting old bonds to hold under new conditions would have been naive. The town wasn't failing socially. It was adapting. But adaptation came at a cost, and that cost was the loss of collective identity. Knowing people had once made life easier here. During the outbreak, it made life heavier, so we learned quietly to stop knowing too much about each other. I noticed the house before anyone mentioned it. In a town this size, absence announces itself quietly, through routines that fail to repeat. The lights never came on that evening. The porch remained untouched. No door opened at hours that had been predictable for years. The house belonged to a couple who never left town. They weren't loud, weren't social, but they were constant. Groceries every Thursday, trash at the curb before sunrise, the kind of presence you stop seeing because it never changes. When it changed, the difference felt heavier than noise. I watched from across the street, not hiding, just waiting. Windows reflected sky without interruption. Curtains stayed fixed. The mailbox filled slowly. No one approached it. That detail lingered longer than it should have. Nobody checked immediately. Small towns avoid conclusions until they're unavoidable. Assumptions carry weight here, and people hesitate to apply them. Still, the pattern grew harder to ignore as the night deepened and the house remained inert. By morning, the town adjusted around it. Foot traffic curved slightly away, conversations lowered nearby. Nobody said anything, but everyone noticed. The house became a landmark of uncertainty, a reference point people pretended not to see. I passed it deliberately, close enough to hear if anything stirred. The silence was complete, not the occupied quiet of sleeping, but the hollow kind that refuses interaction. I felt it in my chest before my mind labeled it. There were no signs of struggle, no damage, no scattered belongings. The house looked prepared for return. That expectation made the emptiness feel wrong. Places usually announce abandonment. This one didn't. The first person to approach wasn't an authority. It was a neighbor carrying habit forward longer than logic allowed. They stood at the door longer than necessary, knocked once, then stepped back as if proximity itself carried risk. The knock changed nothing. Sound entered the house and never came back. That confirmed what silence alone couldn't. Something inside had stopped responding entirely. No one forced entry. Not yet. The town respected thresholds, even under pressure. Crossing them without invitation felt like accusation. So people waited, hoping the house would explain itself. It never did. Hours passed, then a day. The house remained untouched, but its gravity increased. It altered movement patterns. It shortened conversations. It reminded everyone that certainty was eroding without spectacle. Eventually, someone mentioned infection out loud. The word landed poorly, too large for the space. No one argued. They just absorbed it, adjusting posture and distance instinctively. That house became proof without evidence. No body, no confirmation. Just absence sustained long enough to force interpretation. The outbreak stopped being theoretical there. It acquired an address. I understood then how collapse localizes. Not through announcements, but through specific places that refuse to behave normally. That house taught the town what danger looked like without showing it. I didn't need to see what was inside. The stillness had already done its work. One house went quiet, and the town recalibrated around the possibility that others might follow. I mapped the implications privately, aware that a single silent house rewrites behavior faster than any broadcast. Routes shifted, errands compressed. People learned which side of the street to use without discussing it. The town's geometry updated itself around that address, carving out caution as if it was zoning. What stayed with me was how quickly explanation became unnecessary. No one demanded proof. The pattern alone was enough to change conduct. That acceptance frightened me more than denial would have. It meant fear had learned efficiency. I adjusted too. I changed where I stood at dusk. I timed tasks earlier. I stopped lingering near doors. None of those choices felt dramatic. They felt reasonable, which made them permanent. The house didn't spread infection by proximity. It spread constraint by example. From then on, every home carried potential weight. Occupancy mattered. Responsiveness mattered. Normal became conditional. I understood that the town would continue this way, subtracting certainty house by house, until nothing remained worth naming as stable. I accepted that this was the beginning of measurement, not panic. And that staying meant counting these shifts carefully without forcing them into stories yet, fully, deliberately. I stopped expecting help before I admitted it to myself. The realization didn't arrive as disappointment. It arrived as clarity. Once I looked at the town through the same lens planners would use, The absence of response stopped feeling personal and started feeling logical. Help follows concentration. Resources move toward density, not distance. Cities justified attention because outcomes there multiplied quickly. A failure in one place cascaded outward. Here, consequences stayed local. From a strategic perspective, that made us optional. I thought about how emergency logistics work when systems strain. Triage isn't cruelty, it's arithmetic. You direct effort where it preserves the most structure. A town with limited infrastructure and minimal throughput offers little return on investment. That math didn't care about fairness. The town had never been self-sufficient. It relied on regional overlap to function. Ambulances came from elsewhere, supplies arrived on schedules tied to highway traffic. Maintenance rotated through as needed. When the outbreak fractured those connections, nothing replaced them. I listened carefully for signs of coordination. Helicopters, convoys, broadcasts specific enough to suggest intent. None came. Silence wasn't neglect. It was prioritization executed without ceremony. I watched how nearby areas received attention briefly, then lost it. Assistance arrived, assessed, then withdrew. Those places weren't saved. They were evaluated. Once deemed unsustainable, they joined the quiet. Our town skipped that phase entirely. It never justified inspection. No one needed to visit to know the outcome. Low density meant low spread. Low spread meant low urgency. By staying behind, we had chosen invisibility. That invisibility protected us initially. Fewer infected arrived here because fewer people passed through. But protection came with a trade-off. Being overlooked meant being unsupported. You don't get one without the other. I realized how prepared the system was to abandon small places. Not maliciously, efficiently. Emergency planning documents always assume attrition at the margins. Those margins just rarely imagine themselves as such. The town's emergency board dissolved quietly. Meetings stopped being announced. Members stopped attending. There was nothing to coordinate. Without external input, the role became symbolic. Symbols lose power quickly under pressure. I noticed how people adjusted expectations downward. They stopped watching for rescue. They stopped interpreting sirens as promise. Instead, they listened for local changes, a generator running unexpectedly, a light staying on all night. Those details mattered more than distant signals. Help never arrived because nothing here justified its arrival. The town wasn't erupting. It wasn't broadcasting distress loudly enough to compete with larger crises. Quiet places don't register as problems until they vanish entirely. I considered whether I wanted help to come. Intervention brings movement, noise, attention. Attention attracts risk. Staying small kept us off certain maps. That invisibility felt safer than assistance that might destabilize fragile balance. I also understood that even if help had arrived, it wouldn't have stayed. Temporary presence doesn't reverse structural abandonment. Once systems decide a place isn't worth sustaining, attention only delays outcome. People who waited for rescue wasted energy. They scanned horizons instead of adapting locally. Those who accepted isolation adjusted faster. Expectation shapes behavior, and behavior determines survivability. I chose to align with reality rather than resentment. The town wasn't being punished. It was being bypassed. That distinction mattered. Punishment invites protest. Bypass invites adaptation. Understanding why help never arrived stripped the situation of illusion. No cavalry was coming. No external authority would absorb consequences. That knowledge compressed responsibility inward, where it belonged now. The outbreak exposed something that had always been true. Small towns exist at the mercy of larger systems. When those systems fracture, margins become invisible quickly. Survival then depends on recognizing invisibility as a condition, not an injustice. I stopped framing the absence of help as loss. Loss implies ownership. We hadn't owned assistance. We had borrowed it under normal conditions. Those conditions no longer applied. Once I accepted that, planning became simpler. I stopped scanning the sky. I stopped listening for engines. I paid attention to what changed locally instead. The town didn't need saving. It needed understanding. Help never arrived because the system worked as designed under stress. That design just wasn't built to preserve places like this. Recognizing that freed me from waiting and forced me to operate within constraints that were real, immediate, and final. Panic would have been obvious. Shouting, running, collective motion without coordination. None of that happened here. What unfolded instead was quieter and more durable. The town divided itself without discussion, carving invisible boundaries that everyone learned to respect almost immediately. At first, the divisions were subtle. Certain streets lost foot traffic earlier in the day. Some businesses stopped serving anyone they didn't already recognize. Houses that once welcomed casual visits became sealed, interactions compressed to doorways or yards. Nobody announced new rules. They were inferred. Space reorganized itself through behavior. People gravitated toward zones that felt familiar and retreated from those that introduced uncertainty. Corners where conversation once lingered emptied. Open areas became transitional rather than social. The town stopped behaving like a shared environment and started acting like adjacent territories. I noticed how quickly everyone learned which areas belonged to whom. Not ownership in a legal sense, but in a practical one. This block felt watched. That road felt ignored. This stretch of sidewalk suggested tolerance. That one suggested scrutiny. Movement became a negotiation. The partitions weren't enforced aggressively. They didn't need to be. Repetition taught compliance. Someone crossed an invisible line once, received a look or a pause that carried meaning, and didn't repeat the mistake. Social correction replaced authority. Groups formed around proximity rather than affinity. Neighbors coordinated loosely, sharing information selectively, pooling effort when benefit aligned. Cooperation shrank to manageable scale. Large gatherings disappeared entirely, replaced by parallel microsystems operating independently. The town's geography supported this division. Wide lots, long driveways, natural gaps between structures. It had never forced people together. Now that feature became strategy. Distance reduced obligation. Obligation carried risk. I watched how quickly people stopped referencing the town as a whole. Language shifted to my side, over there, that end. Orientation replaced identity. The concept of a unified place lost relevance because it no longer described lived experience. Shared resources became contested quietly. Access hours staggered. Usage windows narrowed. People learned when not to be present. Coordination happened through avoidance rather than scheduling. Everyone wanted what others had, but nobody wanted overlap. Even sounds respected partition. Radios lowered volume. Generators ran briefly, then stopped. Tools were used at times least likely to draw attention. The town learned to breathe in segments, each area exhaling carefully so it didn't disturb the next. I realized partitioning preserved stability. By limiting interaction, it reduced cascade failure. One household's problems stayed contained. One area's noise didn't ripple outwards. Fragmentation prevented collective panic by preventing collective awareness. That fragmentation carried cost. Information traveled slower. Help arrived selectively, if at all. Empathy narrowed. People prioritized zones over people, boundaries over relationships. The town became legible only in pieces. I adjusted my behavior accordingly. I stopped crossing partitions unnecessarily. I treated each area as a separate environment with its own tolerances. Moving between them required recalibration, like stepping between rooms with different rules. No one declared leadership. Authority dissolved into local consensus, enforced through habit rather than power. Decisions were made in isolation, then mirrored elsewhere through observation. The town coordinated without communicating. What struck me was how effective it was. There were no confrontations, no breakdowns. The town functioned at reduced capacity, but it functioned. Panic would have destroyed that balance. Partitioning preserved it. The outbreak hadn't taught people to fear each other. It taught them to limit exposure. That instinct reorganized the town faster than any emergency plan could have. I understood then that staying here meant navigating a map that no longer matched paper. The real boundaries were behavioral. Cross them carelessly and consequences followed, not violently, but persistently. The town didn't fracture into chaos. It segmented into survival cells, each operating with partial awareness of the others. That design reduced noise, reduced risk, and reduced community simultaneously. By the time I recognized the pattern fully, it was already complete. The town no longer existed as a single entity. It existed as a collection of tolerances stitched together loosely by shared memory and geography. Panic never came because it wasn't necessary. Partitioning accomplished the same goal more efficiently. It lowered exposure, controlled movement, and distributed responsibility downward. The cost was cohesion, but cohesion had become expendable. Living inside that structure required discipline. You had to know where you belonged at any given moment and why. You had to respect boundaries that no one defended openly. Survival depended on reading those limits accurately. The town didn't panic. It reorganized itself into smaller, quieter versions of what it had been. Each partition believed it was temporary. None of them planned for reunion. I had assumed immobility would make me harder to notice. That staying meant blending into the background while movement drew attention. In cities, that logic holds. In a small town, the opposite is true. Stillness sharpens focus. When people leave, those who remain become landmarks. At first, visibility felt harmless. Familiarity carried over from old routines. People expected to see me where I had always been. That expectation created predictability, and predictability became exposure. When patterns shrink, repetition stands out. I noticed it in small ways. A glance held a second longer than before. Someone adjusting their schedule to avoid crossing mine. Conversations pausing when I appeared unexpectedly. None of it was hostile. It was evaluative. The town had thinned enough that absence was common, but consistency wasn't. Every day I stayed made me easier to track. My movements formed a map others could learn without trying. That awareness unsettled me more than overt surveillance ever could. I changed routes, then realized the change itself was noticeable. Deviating from habit signaled intention. Intention attracted interpretation. In a small population, any adjustment invites explanation, even when no one asks for one. I watched others handle visibility differently. Some isolated completely, retreating indoors and reducing their footprint until they became theoretical. Others exaggerated presence, making noise deliberately to discourage curiosity. Both strategies carried cost. Staying visible required justification. People wanted to know why I hadn't left, not out of concern, but to calibrate risk. Decisions reflected priorities, and priorities suggested behavior under pressure. Remaining suggested either confidence or denial. Neither reassured anyone. I realized how quickly the town recalibrated social math. With fewer people, individual actions carried disproportionate weight. One mistake echoed longer. One deviation altered assumptions. There was no crowd to absorb error. Leaving would have dissolved my profile instantly. On the road, I would have been anonymous. One more data point in motion. Here I was a constant in a shrinking equation. Every day increased resolution. I started reducing my footprint deliberately. Shorter outings, irregular timing, minimal overlap. I learned how to exist without broadcasting consistency. That required effort I hadn't anticipated. Stillness wasn't passive. It demanded management. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had stayed to avoid becoming a signal, yet staying had turned me into one. Visibility wasn't about noise or motion. It was about recognizability. People began inferring things I hadn't stated, that I had resources, that I had information, that I had plans. None of those were entirely false, but inference rarely matches reality. Assumptions spread faster than facts. I overheard my name used as reference, not in accusation, but comparison. He's still here. He hasn't left yet. The phrasing positioned me as example rather than participant. Examples invite scrutiny. The town had learned to measure safety by reduction. Fewer variables felt safer. Those who remained became variables by default. I was one of them. I considered leaving then, not out of fear, but out of logic. Mobility still offered obscurity, but leaving would have reset risk rather than reduced it. Roads carried exposure of a different kind. I chose to adapt instead. I learned to let days pass without being seen, to compress necessity into brief windows, to accept that invisibility required intentional absence, not comfort. Staying put didn't mean staying obvious. What I hadn't expected was the psychological cost. Being visible meant carrying others' projections silently. Their calculations intersected with mine without negotiation. Every choice felt heavier because it might be interpreted externally. I stopped thinking of the town as neutral ground. It had become an audience, not watching actively but noticing by default. That awareness changed how I moved through space, how I timed decisions, how I measured risk. Staying wasn't easier than leaving. It was different. It traded anonymity for familiarity, and familiarity amplified consequence. I understood then that survival strategies don't scale evenly. What protects you in one environment exposes you in another. I adjusted again, accepting that remaining meant managing perception as much as resources. I couldn't disappear entirely, but I could reduce clarity. Ambiguity became protection. Staying put hadn't made me safer automatically. It had made me legible. Learning how to blur that legibility without provoking suspicion became the next discipline I had to master. In a small town during an outbreak, movement attracts danger, but staying attracts attention. Survival lived somewhere between those forces, and finding that balance required more restraint than I had expected. The town didn't go quiet because people were afraid to speak. It went quiet because speaking stopped being useful. Information lost value once it couldn't be verified or acted on. Conversations that once traded certainty now traded speculation, and speculation carried risk. At first, communication slowed naturally. Fewer people meant fewer interactions. That reduction felt proportional, harmless. But the tone shifted quickly. Words shortened. Questions lost follow-ups. Answers stopped inviting response. Dialogue became transactional, then optional. I noticed how often people chose not to share what they knew, not out of malice, but because knowledge without solutions felt dangerous. If you couldn't help someone act on information, offering it only increased anxiety. Silence became courtesy. The town still had connectivity for a while. Phones worked, internet flickered, radios broadcast, but usage changed. People consumed information privately and withheld interpretation publicly. Everyone listened. No one discussed. Silence moved through social spaces like weather. One household stopped answering messages. Another followed. Soon, unanswered communication felt normal rather than alarming. Expectation adjusted downward until contact became exception instead of baseline. I tested it unintentionally. I stopped initiating contact for several days. Nothing replaced it. No one checked in. The absence of outreach wasn't neglect. It was symmetry. Everyone was conserving energy, attention, and exposure. The quiet wasn't empty. It was dense with calculation. People were listening constantly, measuring tone, timing, and implication before speaking. That hesitation slowed exchange until it vanished altogether. Public spaces reflected the change. The diner closed early not because of fear, but because conversation no longer filled the room. A place designed for talk couldn't justify staying open without it. Silence collapsed businesses faster than infection ever could. I noticed how silence altered trust. Without shared conversation, assumptions filled gaps. People inferred motives from behavior alone. That made actions louder than words had ever been. A closed curtain communicated more than a statement. The town's partitions hardened through silence. Without dialogue to soften boundaries, avoidance became default. Crossing into someone else's space without reason felt invasive. Silence enforced respect more efficiently than agreement. I learned to listen for absence of sound rather than presence. No generator hum where there should have been one. No door closing at expected hours. Those gaps spoke clearly. Silence carried signal once you knew how to read it. Rumors still existed, but they traveled differently. Whispered once, never repeated. Shared selectively, without verification. They didn't spread widely because repetition felt irresponsible. Silence contained misinformation better than correction ever could. I realized then that silence wasn't failure. It was adaptation. The town had discovered that reduced communication lowered risk. Fewer words meant fewer commitments. Fewer commitments meant fewer disappointments. I felt the loss acutely at times. Humans are built for exchange. Silence demanded restraint that felt unnatural. But restraint preserved stability. Every time someone broke it unnecessarily, consequences followed quickly. The infected didn't silence the town. The town silenced itself in response to uncertainty. Infection spread biologically. Silence spread behaviorally. The second moved faster because it required no proximity. I adjusted my own habits. I spoke only when purpose outweighed exposure. I avoided filling space with reassurance. I accepted that not knowing together was safer than speculating aloud. Silence changed time perception. Days blurred without markers created by conversation. That blur felt disorienting, but it reduced urgency. Without constant input, panic struggled to maintain momentum. The town didn't coordinate this shift. It emerged organically, reinforced by outcome. Silence worked, so it persisted. Those who ignored it stood out quickly. I thought about how civilization once relied on constant communication to function. Here, survival depended on the opposite. Reduction replaced expansion. Withholding replaced sharing. By the time I fully understood it, the town had already accepted quiet as normal. Silence didn't feel temporary. It felt structural. In that environment, infection was only one variable. The greater transformation was social. We learned how to coexist without exchange, how to occupy space without conversation. The town didn't lose its voice overnight. It chose not to use it. Silence spread faster than infection because it offered immediate benefit. It reduced exposure, conserved energy, and prevented escalation. In a world where every signal mattered, the safest message became none at all. Living inside that quiet required discipline. It wasn't peaceful. It was intentional. And once learned, it was difficult to unlearn. The town didn't announce its ending. It abandoned it through routine, one habit at a time, until nothing familiar remained to anchor expectation. I noticed the final shift not because something dramatic happened, but because something ordinary failed to repeat. Every town has a rhythm that survives almost anything. Ours had been built around a handful of predictable movements: morning deliveries, afternoon errands, evening lights turning on in the same sequence. Even during the outbreak, those patterns had persisted in reduced form, giving the illusion of continuity. The last routine to hold was the morning opening of the general store. It had stayed functional longer than logic justified. Limited hours, no browsing, no conversation. People entered, took what they needed, paid, and left without comment. The store became a checkpoint rather than a place. One morning, it didn't open. At first, nobody reacted. Delays had become common. People waited from a distance, pretending they weren't waiting. Someone checked the door once, then stepped back. Silence filled the space where expectation used to live. An hour passed, then 2. The lights inside never came on. No sign appeared. No explanation circulated. The routine simply ended. That mattered more than any infected sighting. The store had been the town's last shared behavior, the final overlap that required people to acknowledge each other's presence indirectly. Without it, coordination evaporated completely. I watched people disperse quietly, recalculating plans that no longer included communal access. No frustration surfaced publicly. Acceptance came quickly. Everyone understood what the closure implied, even if no one articulated it. The effect rippled outward. Without the store, timing fractured. People stopped moving at similar hours. Errands dissolved into private schedules. The town lost its pulse. I noticed how sound changed afterwards. Footsteps became rarer. Doors opened less frequently. Even animals adjusted, venturing into spaces they had avoided while people still overlapped. The store didn't reopen the next day, or the next. Eventually, no one checked anymore. The building remained intact, stocked with whatever had been left behind, but it no longer functioned as a node. It became storage without access. That was when I understood the town had crossed its final threshold. It wasn't inhabited collectively anymore. It was occupied individually. Other routines followed quickly. Mail stopped being delivered. Waste collection halted without notice. Fuel availability became theoretical. Each loss would have caused outrage months earlier. Now they registered as confirmation. The absence of complaint struck me. People had learned that protest required audience, and there was no audience left. Collective voice had vanished alongside collective behavior. I realized that the town hadn't failed because of infection or violence. It failed because synchronization ended. Without synchronized routines, there was no reason to act together. And without acting together, there was no town. I felt an unexpected sense of closure watching it happen. Not relief, not sadness, recognition. The process had completed itself cleanly. I stopped orienting my days around anything external. Time became personal. Needs became immediate. Planning horizons shrank to what I could manage alone. The town still existed geographically. Houses stood, roads connected, but functionally it had dissolved. Each structure became an island, linked by memory rather than use. I thought about how many towns might end this way without ever being counted as casualties. No evacuation order. No final broadcast. Just routines quietly stopping. Watching the last routine fall apart taught me that civilization doesn't require catastrophe to end. It requires participation. Once participation stops repeating itself, collapse becomes inevitable and unremarkable. I didn't mark the day on a calendar. There was no point. The town's ending wasn't a moment worth commemorating. It was a process that had finished. From that day on, I stopped referring to the place as a town. It was a location now, nothing more. A set of coordinates with history but no momentum. The outbreak hadn't destroyed it. Time and adaptation had, and staying meant accepting that nothing would pull it back together again. For a long time, staying had been an advantage. Familiarity reduced uncertainty. Limited scale made patterns readable. Isolation slowed outside pressure. Those benefits eroded gradually, not because conditions worsened dramatically, but because the balance shifted against me without announcing itself. The town no longer functioned as cover. With routines gone, movement stood out sharply. Every trip outside my space became visible against a background of inactivity. The fewer people remained, the louder presence became. Staying stopped blending me in and started framing me. Resources tightened unevenly. not through scarcity alone, but through access. What existed wasn't always reachable without crossing someone else's tolerance zone. Partitioning that once protected stability now restricted mobility. Navigating those boundaries required negotiation I couldn't sustain indefinitely. Maintenance became a problem faster than supply. Infrastructure decayed without collective upkeep. Small failures accumulated. A pump faltered. A generator sputtered. Fixing them alone cost time and attention that exposure didn't justify. The town assumed cooperation that no longer existed. I felt the limits of individual endurance clearly. Staying demanded constant vigilance. Every sound had to be evaluated, every pattern monitored. The cognitive load grew heavier each day without offering corresponding advantage. Adaptation turned into attrition. I realized how dependent staying had been on predictability. Once that predictability vanished, the town offered no compensating benefits. It became a static risk rather than a dynamic one. Static risks accumulate. Dynamic risks can be avoided. The infected weren't pressing in aggressively. That wasn't the issue. The problem was stagnation. Staying meant existing inside a shrinking loop where variables only increased, never reset. Without movement, there was no recalibration. Visibility worsened. With fewer reference points, my presence became easier to map. Avoidance strategies required complexity that increased error likelihood. The town's size, once manageable, became confining. I noticed changes in how others behaved around me. Not hostile, evaluative. People tracked who remained, who moved, who adjusted. Remaining too long invited assumptions I couldn't correct. Staying suggested resources or confidence that attracted attention. The town also stopped teaching me anything new. Early on, observation yielded insight. Now patterns repeated without variation. Learning plateaued, staying became repetition without return. I weighed options carefully. Leaving carried immediate risk but restored flexibility. Staying reduced exposure short-term but guaranteed accumulation of unresolved pressure. One path risked disruption, the other promised erosion. I didn't romanticize departure. It wasn't freedom, it was recalibration. The town had served its purpose by revealing its limits. Continuing to rely on it would have been denial disguised as loyalty. I prepared without urgency. Rushing would have advertised intent. I reduced footprint further, staged movement gradually, and waited for a window when absence wouldn't raise questions. The hardest part wasn't logistics. It was relinquishing the idea that staying longer meant resilience. Endurance without advantage isn't strength. It's delay. I thought about how long I could realistically manage alone if something failed completely. The answer shortened each time I asked it honestly. Staying relied on everything continuing to degrade slowly. That wasn't a strategy. It was hope. The town hadn't turned hostile. It had become indifferent. Indifference is harder to negotiate with than threat. There was no leverage left. Leaving wasn't an admission of failure. It was an acknowledgement that conditions had changed. The environment no longer supported the logic that had justified staying. I accepted that staying had become a liability I couldn't manage indefinitely. Recognizing that before it turned catastrophic mattered. Survival often depends on leaving situations before they demand escape. When I committed internally to departure, the weight lifted slightly. Decision reduced uncertainty. The town stopped feeling like shelter and started feeling like history. I didn't announce anything. I didn't explain. Explanations invite interference. Movement would speak for itself once completed. Staying had taught me restraint, observation, and patience. It had also taught me when those traits become counterproductive. Knowing when to stop enduring is as important as knowing how to endure. By the time I finalized my plan, the town had already let go of me emotionally. I felt no pull to remain. That absence of attachment confirmed what logic had already decided. Staying wasn't dangerous yet. That was precisely the problem. Waiting for danger would have been the mistake I couldn't afford. I thought I would learn about survival by testing limits. What I learned instead came from patience. Watching the town empty slowly revealed truths that urgency usually hides. Collapse doesn't demand panic. It rewards those who notice patterns before they harden. The first lesson was scale. Small places don't fail loudly, they thin out. Each departure feels insignificant until absence becomes structural. By the time you can name what's missing, the framework that supported it has already weakened beyond repair. I learned that familiarity is not resilience. Knowing people creates expectation, and expectation creates friction when conditions shift. Deep trust requires surplus, time, safety, margin. When those disappear, familiarity accelerates division instead of cooperation. I learned that systems matter less than participation. The town still had roads, buildings, utilities, and rules. None of that kept it alive. What mattered was synchronized behavior. Once routines desynchronized, structure became irrelevant. I learned that silence isn't emptiness, it's compression. Silence gathers intent, fear, and calculation into something dense. People weren't quiet because they had nothing to say. They were quiet because speaking carried cost. I learned that staying and leaving aren't opposites. They are timing decisions. Staying too long turns insight into liability. Leaving too early trades information for movement. Survival lives in the space between those mistakes. I learned that help follows visibility, and visibility follows density. Small places survive by being overlooked, until being overlooked becomes abandonment. There is no moral weight to that. It's logistics pretending to be fairness. I learned that routine is civilization's skeleton. Once it collapses, culture follows quickly. The loss of shared habits ended the town long before infection ever could. I learned that adaptation feels calm while it's happening. Panic is inefficient. People choose smaller lives instinctively because smaller lives are easier to protect. That instinct empties the world faster than violence. I learned that watching matters. Not intervening, not fixing, not reacting. Observation gives you a margin others surrender early. That margin buys clarity. I learned that places don't save people. People save themselves by choosing environments that still respond. When a place stops offering feedback, loyalty becomes self-harm. I learned that collapse is not a single event. It's a sequence of reasonable decisions that add up to disappearance. No one chooses the end. They choose comfort, caution, and efficiency, and the end arrives quietly. I learned that endurance without re-evaluation becomes stagnation. Staying only works when conditions still teach you something. Once learning stops. So should you. I learned that the most dangerous moment isn't when things fall apart, it's when they stabilize incorrectly. False equilibrium keeps people invested in losing positions. I learned that survival has less to do with strength than with timing. Being early is as important as being prepared. Waiting for certainty is how people get trapped. I learned that small towns don't die because they're weak. They die because they're optional. That optionality doesn't show itself until pressure forces prioritization. I learned that the world doesn't owe continuity to any place. Continuity is maintained through effort and relevance. When effort disperses and relevance fades, the world moves on. Watching the town empty slowly stripped away illusions I didn't know I carried. It taught me to respect processes rather than moments, to track decline without demanding drama. I didn't feel bitterness towards the town. It behaved exactly as its design allowed. It processed people until it no longer could, then released them back into movement. That understanding stayed with me after I left. I stopped expecting environments to sustain me by default. I expected them to signal when they could no longer do so. The town didn't fail me. It educated me. And that education came not from catastrophe, but from quiet subtraction, one absence at a time. By watching instead of reacting, I learned how endings actually work. They don't arrive as warnings. They reveal themselves gradually, to anyone willing to pay attention long enough to see the pattern complete. I didn't leave with the idea that I had won anything. Survival didn't feel like victory by then. It felt like continuation, stripped of meaning people usually attach to it. The town wasn't something to rescue. It had already decided how it would end, long before I accepted that staying no longer made sense. Outlasting something isn't the same as defeating it. The town didn't challenge me. It didn't resist. It simply receded until my presence no longer intersected with anything worth sustaining. There was nothing heroic about recognizing that. It was arithmetic. I didn't carry memories of dramatic moments when I left. No final glance, no symbolic threshold crossed. Departure blended into routine the same way the town's ending had. One more action taken quietly, without audience or announcement. What stayed with me was the clarity that arrived afterward. Distance reframed everything. From outside, the town's slow disappearance looked inevitable rather than tragic. It wasn't a failure of character or effort. It was the outcome of design meeting pressure. I understood then that saving places requires more than endurance. It requires relevance within systems larger than themselves. The town had lost that relevance early. Staying longer wouldn't have changed that equation. It would have only reduced my ability to adjust when conditions shifted again. I thought about the idea of loyalty and how often it's confused with wisdom. Loyalty assumes reciprocity. The town no longer offered any. Expecting it to do so would have been sentimental, not principled. Outlasting the town meant carrying forward what it taught me without carrying the place itself. I didn't preserve buildings or routines, I preserved understanding. That understanding mattered more than geography ever could. I stopped framing my experience as survival of an outbreak. The outbreak was context, not cause. What mattered was recognizing when environments stop responding and how long people pretend otherwise. The town didn't collapse in flames. It didn't beg to be remembered. It dissolved into irrelevance quietly, the way many things do when attention moves elsewhere. That kind of ending doesn't leave monuments. It leaves lessons. I didn't feel guilt for leaving. Guilt implies obligation unmet. The town had already released me by ceasing to require participation. My departure acknowledged that reality rather than denying it. Outlasting the town didn't make me stronger. It made me more precise. I became less attached to structures that only work under ideal conditions. I learned to invest in adaptability rather than place. I realized that many people measure success by what they preserve. I measured it by what I didn't lose internally. Judgment, restraint, timing. Those survived intact. The town became a reference point rather than a destination. Whenever I assessed new environments, I compared how they behaved under strain to what I had witnessed there. That comparison saved me from repeating mistakes. I didn't save the town because it wasn't asking to be saved. It was asking to be understood. Understanding arrived too late to change its outcome, but early enough to change mine. When people later spoke about places like it, they used language that implied sudden loss. They were wrong. Nothing about that ending was sudden. It was gradual enough to be mistaken for adaptation. Outlasting the town meant accepting that some places are not meant to survive certain conditions, no matter how familiar they feel. Recognizing that truth early prevents loyalty from turning into entrapment. I didn't carry the town with me physically. I carried its timeline. The memory of how things end when no one insists on continuation. That memory became a tool. If someone asked whether staying had been worth it, I wouldn't answer immediately. Worth depends on what you value. Staying taught me how to read endings before they announce themselves. That skill stayed useful long after the town disappeared from relevance. I didn't save the town. I didn't rebuild it. I didn't witness its final breath. I simply remained functional long enough to leave when function demanded it. Outlasting something doesn't mean you outlive it in time. It means you don't let it determine how you end. The town taught me that quietly, by stepping aside without protest. That was its final contribution. Not shelter, not safety, perspective. And that was enough.